that we place on giving back to our local community. Every transaction that we close at Lawyers Title, we give back a portion of our profit every quarter to a local chapter. So please know that when you close with Lawyers Title, you are giving back with every single home that you close. Isn't that wonderful? And trust me, so many other foundations in between that we are constantly supporting. I'm sure you see us out there. Sybil makes sure to take really good care of us to make sure that you guys know that we really do care about giving back. We're very, very fortunate and honored to have you as our client, and we love to give back with you. So I want to make sure you know that. Thank you so much. I want to introduce you to a team of people that have put this together for you. And also, as you're business planning, right, I'm sure that you've been business planning, thinking about that since October, putting together your plan. We are here, and this team that I'm about to introduce you to is here to support you at the highest levels, always using proven results, best practices to save you time and money, and making sure that you are doing everything to the best at the highest level, and we will ensure to help you with that, okay? So I'm going to start by just introducing you to that team that you know is going to be here to help you. Adam Bjornson, Chris Antrim, Sybil Fontaine, Jim Rash. We've got Ann Murrell, and she is our Vice President of Escrow for Oregon, and we're so excited she's joining us today. Mr. James Stevens. We've got Tish Schutzler, Linda Dagnan, Aaron Oxenslager. Woo, we got some whistles. I like that. Terry Anderson, and of course our very special Tony, who helps us with all of our technology, and we're sure grateful, yes. Carrie Young is with me somewhere, and she's just a huge, intricate part of putting together these beautiful events for you. And Tyler Burnett, he was out there as well, and Carlene Lodeski. We are very grateful for each and every single one of you as our clients, and I am grateful to my team equally. So without further ado, I'm going to have Mr. Chris Antrim introduce our first wonderful guest. Thank you all for being here.
Hello, one big clap for Denise. She's awesome. We have a great boss. I am so excited. Can I tell you the reason I get to do the introduction is because I actually almost have enough credits in economics to get a degree in it. Not nearly as much as Josh, but that makes me our closest expert in economics.
I love it.
Josh Lanier is the one of the best presenters I've seen. I like to call him, I hope this doesn't know, I'd like to call him the new John Mitchell. You guys have all seen John Mitchell, right? This is the guy that's going to be spitting at you in 20 years. He's going to run around a room just talking his head off, giving you great advice. He's an economist for the state of Oregon, but I know the things you really want to know. He's a husband. He's a father. He is a true believer in native Oregon beers. He's a Timbers fan. And here's the part you can give him a little groan. I learned today that he's a Kansas City Chief fan. Yeah. He's going to give you a peek into what's coming in the next year. So if you give a warm welcome to Josh Lanier, please.
All right, thanks, Chris. Thanks to Lawyers Title. It's great to be back, being up here talking about housing. And the great thing about talking with realtors and title companies and the clients is I don't have to change anything from a normal presentation. A lot of the fun stuff that we get to do in our office when it comes to forecasting the Oregon economy, translating that into tax revenues for the state. That's our prime directive, is we're making guesses and predictions of how much money is going to flow into the tax system. Then the legislature and policymakers get to spend it on education and roads and all that sort of stuff. But all the stuff that goes into that when it comes to population growth and the dynamics that we're seeing in the housing market, and housing affordability has been such a big challenge in recent years in particular. This is the stuff that we're looking at every single day, just like you guys are. So when I get to come talk with you, it directly feeds into some of the stuff you're dealing with on the ground level when I'm just dealing with a spreadsheet in a cubicle. And Chris was way too kind. John Mitchell is an economic legend, and if I am half the economist that he is at the end of my career, I will be a very happy man. And so with that, I want to talk about where we are in the economic business cycle today, and then some of the specific drivers in the housing market over the next couple of years that we're seeing from our office. And we're at a very different point in the business cycle today than we have been in quite some time. The economy's still growing. The economy's never been bigger. Our incomes for the typical household have never been bigger, and they're continuing to get bigger each and every year. Sales are going up, population's going up, economic production is going up, but we're now starting to slow down a little bit. So that pace of change from one year to the next year is starting to slow. This chart in front of you talks about employment growth. How many jobs have we added in the past 12 months in the state of Oregon versus the U.S. overall? You'll notice the dark blue line in Oregon, we're more volatile. We're more boom-bust than the typical state for two primary reasons. The first one is our industrial structure. Our manufacturing sector here in Oregon has still shrunk over time like the typical manufacturing industry across the entire country. It's just shrunk considerably less than, say, in Ohio or in Michigan or in Georgia or some of these other places that have seen the really big, painful declines. When it comes to our goods producing industry and our manufacturing industry, the only one that really looks like that is wood products, right? We've had a massive decline in wood products in the last generation in Oregon and the Northwest more broadly. Outside of that, our manufacturing industries have done significantly better when it comes to semiconductors, when it comes to transportation equipment, which is aerospace in particular, with Boeing having a big operation out in East Portland. And places like that continue to grow and do better over time. And the manufacturing industry is very boom-bust over the business cycle. When we're falling into recession, people hunker down, they're scared to spend their money because they're not sure how much they'll have tomorrow. They don't need to buy a computer every year, and so you delay the purchase of a computer a couple of years until your household budget's repaired. That produces a big swing in semiconductors and Intel operations and things like that. And so that's one reason why Oregon is more volatile, more boom-bust than the typical state. The other one, something that's much more near and dear to your guys' heart, is population growth, right? People hunker down during recessions, not just in terms of their spending and not spending money. They also don't move. Why would I move somewhere else and not get a job when I can stay right where I am and not have a job, right? It's the devil you know versus the devil you don't. And so now that the economy is doing better again, we're reaching our full capacity. We're not there yet. We're getting close. We're starting to hit full employment, which is basically, the definitions vary, but it's basically anyone who wants a job can find a job relatively easy. You always have some sort of people unemployed, whether they're just in a temporary transition from when they get laid off at one company. It takes at least a couple of weeks, a couple of months, to fill out an application, get an interview, get hired at another company. That sort of unemployment is always going on in the economy. The problem is when we have unemployment due to the fact that there's no jobs, period. That's no longer the case. We have plenty of jobs now, plenty of job openings, and so we kind of have a different state of unemployment that's very, very low today. And so, during a good economy, migration flows pick up, and we certainly have seen that again here in Oregon. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But the biggest thing to talk about is not only is growth slowing a little bit in recent years and will continue to slow over the next couple of years, it's really finally translating into these really good, positive dynamics for the typical households across the country, and particularly here in Oregon. What do I mean by that? Household income, right? Household income in Oregon is typically lower than in the U.S. overall. Well, the latest census data that just came out a couple of months ago says that's no longer true. The dark blue line is now on top of the light blue line. The typical incomes here in Oregon are now matching the U.S. because of our stronger economic growth. We've put more people back to work. We've put more people back to work full-time in particular. These aren't, the concern in 2010, 11, and 12 is that, well, all this job growth we're getting is just low-wage service jobs. It's part-time, it doesn't pay very much, we're putting people back to work, but they're not good jobs. That narrative was overblown. We're having good job growth in 2012, there's no question. It's just, the narrative hadn't quite formed that the economy really was recovering from the deepest financial crisis and recession we've seen in 3 generations. Well, today, after all of these years of putting people back to work and putting them back to work in good jobs and at full-time work, 40 hours a week, we're now seeing that translate into these income gains. And you can see here, there's good news and bad news. The bad news, of course, is that household income trends in the last 20 years have been flat, right? There's no question that incomes have been stagnant for the vast majority of the population in the last 20 years. However, there's movements around this overall stagnant trend, and right now the trajectory is pointing up. More people have a job, they're working full-time, and they're getting wage gains on top of that, and that's what's driving these trends. Give it another couple years, provided the next recession doesn't come. and economists don't think the recession is coming in the immediate future. And we'll finally burst through this 20-year stagnant trend of income, and we'll propel ourselves to something we haven't seen in quite some time. Again, that doesn't mean households are doing well. The typical household is still living paycheck to paycheck. It's just that household paycheck is a little bit bigger today than it ever has been before. And so we're starting to make some progress on these stagnant trends that have been staying with us for so long. And so the corresponding component here is not only are households doing better financially, it's also directly translating into falling poverty rates, falling caseloads for needs-based programs when it comes to food stamps and Medicaid and things like that. That's also impacting the public sector and is a general measure of economic and health well-being as a society, right? We're starting to get to the point where these things are happening. It took forever to get here, and we haven't been here since the late 1990s, to be honest. This is the best economy we've had since 1999 or 2000, but we're just now back to this point, and the longer the expansion continues, the more all these positive things will continue to happen. Now, the different phase we're going into the business cycle is not only have we put people back to work and all these positive good things are happening, but we're about to hit into some supply constraints. And this is just an important point to talk about, not from the pure economics point of view, but now that we don't have a lot of unemployed workers, we don't have a lot of spare capacity at our manufacturing facilities and our plants and around the country and things like that. This also means growth will be slower, maybe a little bit more choppy moving forward. As we start to run up against some of these supply constraints, growth's going to be a little bit more volatile. The GDP numbers and the employment numbers and the income numbers, they're going to bounce around a little bit more because once you hit that supply, it takes a while to make the business investment to expand and add a new facility or add new equipment or add new plants, find new workers and things like that. And so things that might impact the economy next year, the year after, would be the things in the red. Lack of labor, it's harder to find workers today. There's still some available. You have to pay them more. Maybe you have to train them up on the job because they don't have a perfect resume, because they have a gap due to long-term unemployment or something like that. It's, the sparkling resume and the perfect candidate coming into your office to fill a position no longer exists like it did in 2010 or 11 when unemployment was 10%. When unemployment is 4%, it's a lot harder to find workers. And then you have to pay them more. And so those are some of the issues we think as an economy will start to run up against. Some of the other things that can send us into recession or hamper our growth over on the blue, these are general supply side constraints on the economy, but we don't think these are going to be near-term issues. At least they don't look to be likely near-term issues. It doesn't mean they can't crop up and be a problem. Anytime we get an oil shock, oil goes back up, gas will go to $4 a gallon, that hampers the economy because it squeezes household budgets. That could be a problem, as it always seems to crop up when you don't expect it, so that's a potential risk moving forward. So this is where the economic discussion is moving. Now that we're starting to get closer to a full capacity economy, full employment, these are some of the things economists will be talking about more and more. So what does this mean for the outlook? Again, we still think it'll be positive. We'll still be adding jobs on a given month basis, any given month basis, just at a little bit slower pace than what we've become accustomed to, both in past economic cycles and what we've seen in the most recent few years. If you pay attention to the monthly jobs report that come out every month at the state level, and you see it in the newspaper or on Oregon Live or what have you, there's been some wild swings in the last 4 months. Huge gains up, huge gains down. Don't pay too much attention to that month-to-month noise. This noisy data is going to be revised 3 more times, and once it's been revised, it's going to look a lot more stable and steady than maybe what those headline numbers will indicate every 4 or 5 weeks. So moving forward, we'll still add jobs. We'll add them basically we think we're transitioning down from full throttle economic growth to something more sustainable over the longer term. And what that means, in particularly here in Oregon, is we're going to add as many jobs as we need to keep up with population growth. Because there's not so many unemployed people anymore, but we still have people moving here each and every week that are looking for work. And so that job growth is transitioning down to something more along the lines of 1.5%, 2%, somewhere in that range on a year-over-year basis, which is keeping up with the working age population growth and things like that. So which industries are driving this growth, and which ones do we think will continue to propel us moving forward? Charts like these can be a little bit hard to decipher and get real meaning out of. The short answer is what's driving growth. It's the big service sector industries that employ a ton of people. So we're talking about professional business services, which is a wide-ranging industry that goes anywhere from accountants and attorneys to temporary help workers, and also included in professional business services are garbage truck drivers, right? You know, the trash industry, the waste industry, that's included. It's a really big industry, but it's been growing really, really quickly, and that's been primarily in the high-wage occupations when it comes to office work and consultants, and I mentioned attorneys and whatnot. A lot of those types of jobs have been really driving this, and we're expecting them to continue moving forward. The other one's healthcare. This is both high-wage hospital and doctor office occupations when it comes to nurses and doctors and things like that, but it's also on the low wage scale at the same time when it comes to home health care aides and personal assistants and personal aides and things like that. Some of the lower level nursing, those are also growing really, really quickly, so it spans a wide range of job opportunities. The other one up there near the top would be government, starting to add jobs at a moderate clip, 2%, 2.2%, I believe. For the next year, really for the next couple of years, we're really starting to hire more teachers back. That's where the brunt of the recession hit the public sector. It hit our finances, but when it came to layoffs, it really fell on the teachers. And so we're starting to hire teachers back. Maybe not here in Portland, Portland Public Schools too much in the most recent couple of years, but moving forward, we're expecting those to come back to a certain degree as the state budget and property taxes and things like that continue to increase with the economy. We'll see more teachers hired again, less administrative desk jockeys like myself. And then also leisure and hospitality, right? That's another really big sector of the economy that's continuing to grow and get bigger each and every year, but that pace has slowed, and we expect it to slow a little bit further in the next couple of years as those minimum wage increases start to bind and start to constrain the tourism sector and some other industries a little bit more than they have to date. Right now, the minimum wage hike in the legislation isn't really impacting the economy too much because the labor market overall is tight. You can't hire anybody for $10 an hour anymore. So when we're hiking that minimum wage, and I'm remiss to know exactly where it is in the Portland numbers today. I think it's $11, $12 an hour. Well, you can't hire anyone for that wage anyway. And so the minimum wage effectively in the economy is $14, $15 an hour, maybe more than that depending upon the sector. And so the minimum wage isn't as big of a deal as maybe when the legislation was passed a few years ago. That said, moving forward, as it starts to creep up to $12, $13, $14 an hour, it's going to start to impact these industries a little bit more. And so we think these tourism, these low-wage sectors are going to slow even further moving forward due to some of this minimum wage legislation. So if you guys are interested, in particular when it comes to the near-term housing outlook, population growth, income, bank financing, mortgage lending, all that sort of stuff I'll get to, but I think it's something to keep in mind. This is something we talked about a year ago, is that housing affordability, while it's at the tip of everyone's tongue and it's such a big concern, and it's become a bigger concern for policymakers in recent years, and that's something Matt will talk about here shortly. Housing affordability by itself is not necessarily where we want to put all of our focus. There's big concerns about affordability, and to the extent that if we become so unaffordable, we're going to choke off that population growth that drives our overall economy. If people can't afford to move here, our long-term outlook for the Oregon economy will be lowered because there'll be fewer workers, fewer potential workers moving forward, and that'll make all of our problems worse. Business sales, your guys' sales, will be slower than you'd expect otherwise. It'll make the fiscal challenges in the public sector worse. It'll make the PERS problem worse because those long-term growth rates will be slower because people can't afford to move to Oregon, right? So there's real concerns with affordability, not only to the fact that if you can't afford a roof over your head and you're homeless and on the street and all the issues that are associated with that. Don't get me wrong, there's absolutely some real challenges associated with this, but the focus purely on affordability can be a little bit misplaced. And some of you, if you were here a year ago, we went into this more in depth, right? When it comes to a region or a metropolitan area or a state, we really want to achieve positive results on all of these, right? We want to have good housing affordability for our residents and our neighbors. We want to have a strong regional economy. We want to have a high quality of life. Unfortunately, you can't achieve success on all three dimensions at the same time. That's why it's called a trilemma. At best, you can achieve success on 2 out of these 3 dimensions, and a lot of places in the country only get to succeed on 1. So I'll go quickly through some of these other regions. I've updated this work for the record relative to what was published But we first issued this report about 18 months ago, and so I hadn't really updated it. But Carrie asked, she's like, well, if you had an update on that, that'd be great. And so in the last 24 hours, I've been scrambling to try and update this a little bit. So this is the first time these new numbers are being shown. The story remains the same, but the relative, there'll be a couple things that are different if you're familiar with this. So the reason why we affordability focus purely by itself may be a little bit misplaced is because look at the places in the country that have good affordability. We're talking about the Rust Belt, right? They don't have anything else going for them. They have an underperforming economy. It's really cold and they get a lot of snow. The quality of life isn't so great. People are moving away from it. And so they're struggling on those dimensions. But that means the end result of that is there's not a lot of demand to live in these places. And the places that are seeing shrinking population are seeing increased vacancies when it comes to their housing market. That puts downward pressure. It means they have cheap prices. Youngstown, Ohio, the most recent data, they're now up to about $105,000 for the typical house, right? You know, it's really, really affordable to live in Youngstown, Ohio, but it's hard to find work. And again, the winters in Ohio are terrible. Other places in the country where we're seeing stuff is the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt in particular has a lot of job growth, a lot of population growth. They have moderate to good affordability, but they're struggling on the quality of life metrics. And again, this quality of life metrics isn't just me in a cubicle saying, hey, I think this city's a cool place to live and this one's not. Pulling from some academic literature here where they look at crime rates, distance to the ocean, they're looking at bars and restaurants, and sunny weather and cold weather, heating and cooling degree days, if you're familiar with those terms, stuff like that. They're putting them all together in these big academic papers, and then they rank all the metropolitan areas across the country. And I'm just pulling from that. And again, when it comes to the Sun Belt, you can see they do really well in economic strength. Again, job growth is relatively quicker than it is in the rest of the country, in the South in particular, the Sun Belt, less so. Maybe Nevada, Arizona, they qualify too, but maybe not a little less so on this dimension. But again, what they're struggling with is the quality of life. And so sometimes people ask the question, well, if you had to choose where to live, or maybe you want to weight these differently, you don't want to weight each of these three dimensions equally, right? What do people end up choosing? You can see the Sun Belt is what people end up choosing because they're seeing the fastest population growth. What are the two primary reasons people move? It's jobs and housing. And those are two things that the Sun Belt does extremely, extremely well. And so people will maybe discount the quality of life because what it costs to live in places with a high quality of life and to live in Southern California on the coast or something like that, it's just too much to afford. And so people will discount quality of life when it comes to their actual everyday decisions. It doesn't mean we don't care about it and we don't want it. It just means it costs a whole lot of money to live in some of these very beautiful places in the country. You can see here places that have high quality of life but are lacking the other things are basically New England outside of New York City and the inland part of California. We lose sight of this fact here in Oregon that California, particularly relative to the rest of the country, is a really, really nice place to live, even if you're not on the coast, right? Inland, we think, well, that's a really hot agricultural valley or something like that, but it's still a lot nicer than a lot of places when it comes to climate and weather and things like that compared to the country. Places that do the best, we see three distinct regions here. One are the Great Plains. It's not so much that the Great Plains knock any one of these dimensions out of the park, it's that they kind of backdoor their way into not looking the worst in any particular regard. And I say that with the nicest tone in my voice as I can, because I am from Oklahoma City, and I do like the Chiefs, as Chris was saying. Right? This is the part of the country that I come from, and I just got back from spending a week in Kansas City. My grandma turned 93 years old a couple weeks ago, and she's still in good health. She's still doing really, really well. In Kansas City, I love the barbecue, right? And it's really affordable to live there, but they're not necessarily knocking any of these things out of the park, but they're also not struggling to meet affordability challenges or jobs. There's plenty of jobs in Kansas City. The income's pretty decent and all that sort of stuff. The part that's coming, and you know this very well, where does that leave Portland? Where does that leave the Northwest? Where does that leave all the hip, popular, cool metropolitan areas across the country? They're down here in this bottom quadrant, this bottom segment of this Venn diagram. And you can see all of these places have a strong regional economy, a high quality of life, but they struggle with housing affordability. Some struggle to a larger degree than others, but they still all have poor to terrible housing affordability. partly because they're victims of their own success. The population, the demand to live there, the population is growing, outstrips supply. That's partly because they're actively reducing the supply or trying to not build as much housing as they should through NIMBYism and policies and things like that. There's no question that's impacting it. But at the same time, even if they were to build more housing, they'll still get more people to live there. It would help with pricing, but it's not like prices are going to plunge along any of these locations. You can see here, Portland actually moved in the good direction in these rankings in the last couple of years. We used to be 93rd worst out of the 100 largest metropolitan areas for housing affordability. We're now 88th worst, right? So we moved up 5 rankings, which is better. It's still one of the least affordable metropolitan areas to live in the entire country. Sure, our sticker prices are lower, right? Our sticker prices for housing and rents and things like that are lower than in Seattle or in the Bay Area or things like that. But those other places also have higher incomes, and higher incomes even once you adjust for the cost of living. And so that's part of the reason why we look so bad here. And we've also seen good income growth in the last couple of years, in particular here in the Portland region. A couple places that have struggled in the last couple of years since I've updated the data. Boise fell considerably. Boise used to be pretty good on affordability. Now they're less good. They're better than Portland. They're better than Seattle, but not quite as good as they looked a couple of years ago. And Denver's really plunged in the rankings when it comes to this too. And Denver's one of those places where they're building as much. Boise and Denver, for that matter, they're building as much housing as they can, but there's something impacting the housing market where we're not able to build enough. We know that's true here in Portland. We have a supply problem, right? Well, it's also a supply problem elsewhere in the country. And so this is something that the industry and economists still are coming to grips with. What is the reason for the lack of supply everywhere in the country? Everyone wants to say it's our land use laws, and I'm not here to say our land use laws here in Oregon don't matter. I think it's very clear by restricting our land through the urban growth boundary and whatnot over the long term, that raises our housing costs. It provides benefits that are harder to measure, right? The fact that I can drive in 20 minutes, get from my house in Southwest Portland to an orchard where I'm picking apples, right? That is a positive benefit for us, and a lot of people value having that urban growth boundary and the farmland and everything. But it's a hard thing to measure, right? Or it takes me 30 minutes to get up to Sauvie Island for the pumpkin patch and stuff like that with my kids, right? There are benefits associated with our land use system. They're just a lot harder to measure than it is on the cost side when we talk about how much more expensive our housing is. But Denver and Boise and Austin, they don't have the same land use systems we have. In fact, I've never once heard anybody talk about Idaho's land use laws. But that said, Boise's vacancy rate, the share of homes that are available for rent or for sale, or the share of apartments for that matter, is lower than it is here in Portland, right? And Boise leads the nation in new home construction in a typical year. Austin and Boise are kind of 1-2 depending upon the year. They're still not able to build enough. And so when we have a macro problem, a nationwide problem with housing supply, you have to look for a nationwide solution or a nationwide reason for the macro problem. And so pointing at Oregon's land use laws and saying that's the reason for the problem doesn't make sense when we're also talking about Dallas and Austin and Boise and Denver where those same restrictions don't apply. Again, don't get me wrong, our land use laws impact our housing market considerably, but what's happened in the last 5 to 7 years is something else entirely that's layered on top of our long-term issues with our land use system. So that's an update on the trilemma, where Portland does. We ranked a little bit better today than last time I was in front of you guys. Looking forward, there's still a lot of positive things going on. We're still expecting growth to continue. We're still expecting the population growth to continue, and it's shifting a little bit. The types of people that are moving here have shifted a little bit. But what you see here is actual population data through 2017, as reported by Portland State University, which is the official purveyor of Oregon population numbers. The 2017 data was just released a couple weeks ago. It's preliminary. It'll be finalized sometime this month, but it'll look very similar to this. And then moving forward is the most recent Portland forecast from Portland State. Our office's Portland region forecast looks very much similar. It's going to be slower moving forward than what we've seen in the last few years. It's not going to drop off overnight. 2018 is not probably going to be a substantial step down like you see here. That's more of a nature. We do a 5-year forecast. So between 2015 and 2020, over those 5 years, how much will the population grow? And then from 2020 to 2025, how much will the population grow over those 5 years? I've just averaged them here. There'll be a slower tapering to this than a sharp drop overnight, or at least that's what a year-to-year forecast would look like. But again, we're going to see slower growth moving forward, right? The jobs are starting to slow. The economy overall starting to slow. We expect the population growth to follow suit and slow as well. And we actually thought that would happen in 2017. Some of the leading indicators for population growth, in particular, the number of driver's licenses that are surrendered or given up at the DMV has turned down a little bit, right? It's come off of its peak, so that means migration is likely slowing down at the same time. But when Portland State crunched the numbers for the whole year, they're saying, well, maybe not so much. Maybe population growth held steady or even picked up just a hair in 2017 relative to 2016. The other thing you'll note about this chart is the blue section, the dark blue versus the light blue, right? We've had this massive movement across the country, the return of the city, right? The city center, the downtown, the urban cores of America have been revitalized in the last 10 years, right? Relative to historically when we had the great inversion where everyone left the city center in the 1970s. Well, in the last 10, 15 years, they've come roaring back. The city centers where everything's happening. It's the economic heart of a region. That's true. But it still is only 25% of our population growth here in the metropolitan areas in the city of Portland itself, not just the downtown core, but all of the rest of the whole city, right? Even with this great resurgence in the return of the city, the suburbs still account for 75% of the population growth. And so moving forward, we expect this relative pattern to continue. The city should still be strong. There's still a ton of apartments coming out of the ground today that will be eventually filled by new residents. That said, the suburbs will still be disproportionately where the population growth is being felt and being seen. When it comes to the types of migrants we're getting, they're increasingly educated to higher degrees, if that makes sense. That migrants and people moving across state lines are always young, right? Migration is for the young. People don't move when they're in their 40s or 50s or 60s, right? It's when you're in your root-setting years, you know, that time period from when you graduate high school or you graduate college to the time period where you're in your early 30s. Those are your root-setting years, and that's when people move. Now, the shift within that young migration population is increasingly to people with college degrees. Somewhere 40–50% of the young people moving to the Portland region have a college degree, and half of them have a scientific, technical, or a medical degree, which hasn't historically been the case. Portland is known historically for its art scene, right? Bringing in all the people with basket weaving degrees into the area. We do drum circles and all that fun stuff that we love so much about Portland. But it's increasingly moving towards the more technical skills. It's clearly seen in the data. It's being felt in our industry, the types of job growth that we're seeing. We lead the nation, not lead the nation, we're in the top 5. Out of the 100 largest metropolitan areas, Portland is in the top 5 in the last decade for high-wage job growth, educational attainment increases, what you see here, and also household income growth, right? And so Portland is in transition. We're pulling away from our former economic peers. We used to look much more like a Rust Belt city, right? Our larger manufacturing industry, we have the port, and we're on the water and all that sort of stuff. Much more of a blue-collar, Rust Belt type metro, even though we're on the West Coast. The industrial structure has shifted, and we're starting to pull away from those former economic peers, but we're still nowhere close to being a Denver or a Seattle or San Francisco or a Minneapolis, what the Portland Business Alliance used to call, or I think they're going to change the names in their new report when it comes out soon. They used to call them our aspirational metros, our aspirational types of places we wanted to be because of their higher educational attainment and industrial structure and incomes. Well, Portland's on its way, right? We're halfway there now, but getting all the way to being one of those top-tier metros in the U.S. Will be really difficult. It's been difficult to see the growth we've seen already, but we're on the path, and we're starting to see a lot of these positive things come to fruition. We're just not there. We're just not there yet. Specifically for homeownership, it's clear that it's on the rise. Maybe not substantially or really robust gains in homeownership, but the market has shifted, right? There's been a number of reports that have come out at the national level about we're a nation of renters now. Homeownership has plunged after the bubble and the crash and all that sort of stuff. Well, that's true. People were thrown into being renters because of financial reasons. They got foreclosed on, or there was not enough housing for them to buy a home, and so they had to rent one of these new apartments. For all these reasons, rentership increased substantially. Well, that's starting to reverse itself. The pendulum is starting to swing back to home ownership. In Portland, we've seen 2 years in a row of increasing home ownership. In Seattle, they saw 2 up years and then 1 down. Looking forward, we expect home ownership to basically move sideways, right? And maybe it'll go up or down a little bit year to year, like the Seattle down blip in the 2016 data. It'll probably reverse itself in 2017. And so the pendulum has clearly shifted back, as I said, towards ownership for a couple of reasons. The first one is millennials are aging. Believe it or not, people get older every single day. And as you start to age from those root-setting years, you start to want different things in your life. And the peak millennial today is somewhere 26 years old or so. Right? That's the single most common age in the nation today is 26 years old. And so as you enter in your late 20s and into your 30s, that single family home in the suburbs with a good school district looks a whole lot more attractive than it does when you're 20 years old or 24 years old. And so, this return of the city stuff we've seen and all these apartments that are coming out of the ground in the urban core was at least partly driven by the demographics of these bulging millennials were just exiting their college years right as the economy crashed. And so then they started to get a job, they started to move out from their parents' basement a little bit, and they wanted to live in an urban setting because, living above a bar is really, really cool when you're 23 years old. It's not so cool when you're 32 years old. And so this right here, this population growth and the household formation we're expecting to see over the next decade, you see this in the home ownership rates in the red, right? The biggest, we'll start first with the 2 big blue bars here on the right. These are baby boomers aging in place. We're not getting a massive bulge of new baby boomers moving to Portland or moving to Oregon. The Oregon looks similar to this. It's about them aging in place. So they're going from being 50 or 60 years old to being 60 or 70 years old. That's all those indicate. The stuff on the younger end, that really is about people moving here. People moving in their 20s and their 30s. So we'll get people starting to buy homes to a larger degree. Last time I did the detailed analysis here, 34 years old in the Portland metropolitan areas when you were 50% homeownership, 50% rentership, right? So as that bulge of millennials that are now entering their late 20s, over the next 10 years, they're going to pass that mark where it's 50-50 owner-renter. So that's part of the big reason ownership is coming back. Another one, their banks are lending more. This is just up-down vote when it comes to loan officers at banks and financial institutions across the country. Are you loosening standards or tightening standards and regulations when it comes to mortgages? If you're below the line, that means you're loosening. They don't tell you how much you're loosening. You can look back here, 2005, 2006, the line is just a little bit below 0. It means the banks are admitting they're loosening, but we know they were loosening standards a whole lot during that time period. And so today, we're continuing to loosen mortgages. And so that means credit availability for potential buyers is increasing. Now, they're not loosening standards along all dimensions. You still have to have a really, really high credit score relative to 10, 20 years ago. But the down payment, now you can basically go back to no down payment or very minimal, the FHA loans and things like that. I'm not sure that's great for the housing market, only being able to put down 3%, 4%, 5% of a down payment. The prices are so high that you have to do that to be able to get people into homes in recent years. So banks are opening up the spigots a little bit more for ownership. Something else that will impact the industry, or interest rates should be rising. Whether they will or not is, again, a big open question within the economics profession. You can see here I've banded it. The Federal Reserve has been raising rates for the last couple of years. They're expected to hike 4 more times in the next 12 months. One time next week, they're supposed to raise interest rates 25 basis points or 0.25% next week, and then 3 more times in 2018. And they've kind of painted themselves into this corner. They've been saying this in so many words for so long now that this red line increasing a full percentage point in the next 12 months, something drastic has to happen for the Federal Reserve to back away from that. They've put off these interest rates hikes for so long now because the economy has been weak enough to not justify hiking rates. But now that the economy is starting to show better strength, they're pretty much committed to this path unless something drastic happens. So what does that mean for long-term rates? What does that mean for treasury bills and for mortgage rates and things like that? That's the big question. Historically, long-term rates moved with short-term rates. But in the last 15 years, they haven't. Last cycle, Last cycle, long-term rates didn't budge at all as the Federal Reserve was raising interest rates in 2005, 6, and 7. Those long-term rates, mortgage rates, and things like that still kept coming down. And so that's the question, is moving forward, will interest rates kind of move sideways in this around 4% range that we've seen for the last couple of years? Or will they move in lockstep one for one with the short-term rates? I'd tell some of your clients to be prepared for them to go up a full percentage point in the next year, which has a big implication on what they can afford, right? The 1% increase in interest rates means they can afford 10% less house for the same percentage of their income in dollar for dollar. But that said, I think that's more of an upside risk because these long-term rates are signaling other things than what the Federal Reserve wants to believe is happening. What they're saying is that we're kind of locked into this low-growth environment we've seen for the last 8 years. We're not really going to pull out of this low-growth environment for a number of reasons. We can get into those some other time if you want, but I think that's what the market participants are signaling to the Fed, is that these long-term rates are capped at where they are. You guys better be careful in hiking that red line, because if you hike it too fast, too quickly, you can choke off economic growth, and it's not going to do anything for those long-term interest rates. So that's another thing that the economists and Fed watchers and policymakers are really discussing quite a bit amongst ourselves and our when we get our tinfoil hats out and discuss in the office. But again, it's a risk for home buyers and a risk for your clients, is that interest rates should rise because the Fed is tightening and the economy is strong. Whether or not they will rise or not says a whole lot about other things in the economy. So that's why I have it banded between 4 and 5% a year from now. They'll either not rise very much, or they'll rise in lockstep one for one with the Federal Reserve, broadly speaking. So credit availability is better. Demographics are favorable for home buying. Production is increasing. Here's our forecast for Oregon housing starts. We've been underbuilding housing for quite some time for a variety of reasons. We talked a little bit about those a minute ago. We're expecting to increase production, new housing starts to go up another 20% or so over the next 2 years. So we'll have more homes on the market. Inventory has bottomed in a lot of places, particularly here in Portland. I thought it had bottomed about 2 years ago. It hit bottom, started inventory, active residential listings have started to increase again, but then they plunged right back down to a new low, and now they're rising again. I think this, for this time, probably is a real bottom for the inventory on the market. That said, it doesn't necessarily have to be. If we get a surge of population growth or surge of buying demand, people trying to get in ahead of these potential interest rate increases, maybe we'll see that inventory go back to where it was 6 months, 12 months ago. But that said, it does seem like it has bottomed. How fast it increases is kind of all about how fast we can produce homes relative to that population growth. The other thing moving forward, the prices are moderating, right? They've already come down. They spent nearly 5 years near double digits. Some years a little above, some years a little bit low. If you look at the latest numbers from the realtors, median home price in Portland is now 8% year over year. The Case-Shiller index is 7%. I think I'm 0.5%. I think it's about 7.5% and 8.5%. Our forecast moving forward for Oregon numbers, these are Oregon numbers over the next couple of years, we're looking at 7%, 6%, 5%. So tapering down because we think we'll have better balance in the housing market. Population growth is slowing a little bit. New production, new housing starts are increasing a little bit. That'll bring better balance to the market. I don't think we'll get all the way back to being in balance, right? I think we're so out of whack in the housing market today, and we have been for so long, but we still think we'll get better balance with these trends over the next couple of years, so that should moderate prices. Wild card for you guys in what the impact will be on home buying and the whole housing industry more broadly is what's going on at the federal level with federal tax reform. They've thrown a whole lot of stuff together into a $1 trillion revenue loser that's primarily on the corporate side. But on the personal side, what they seem to have done, and it depends upon whether you're looking at the House bill or the Senate bill, they're going to get in conference and try and figure it out and pass something. This month is their goal. We'll see. They basically, in the personal income tax code, they've raised taxes $3 trillion, but they've also cut them $3 trillion. So on net, the personal income tax code is unchanged at the total population level, but that $3 trillion up and down has a whole lot of different complicating factors. And whether you personally or some of your clients personally will be better off or worse off under the new system, it really depends upon all the unique circumstances and the different deductions you have or potential deductions and all that sort of stuff. Moving forward. So it's a really hard thing to say. They're saying right now a third of households will see a tax increase in the next couple of years. And modeling it for myself, it seems like I might be one of those third that'll see a short-term tax increase. Whether that's true or not, again, it's really complicated. We don't know all the details, but specific things that attach to home buying and housing, mortgage interest deduction, right? I think the house, one of them capped it, right now you can deduct up to $1 million or $1 million purchase for interest, mortgage interest for a household or for a tax filer. Well, they might bring it down to $500,000 and only for new purchases. So your existing homeowners are grandfathered in if they have a $800,000 or $900,000 mortgage or what have you. But moving forward, you can only do the $500,000. So that would be something that could potentially interest some of the higher end market, the luxury housing, and increasingly the not so luxury housing, given where prices have gone. So that's a potential thing that's in there. That seems to be, changing that seems to be in both of them to a certain degree. And capping property tax deductions. They both the House and the Senate have eliminated the SALT, the state and local taxes on the income and sales tax side. Both of them have thrown those out entirely, so you can no longer deduct those on your income tax returns. The property taxes are capped at $10,000. Some quick back of the envelope numbers for the city of Portland looks like that's about 7% of single family homes have property taxes at $10,000 a year or above. Now, this is a rough estimate. I have the property tax rolls from a couple of years ago. We know how property taxes have increased in the last couple of years, so I just inflated those values and then looked at all the single family homes. So it's roughly in that ballpark, maybe 6 to 8%, I'd be more comfortable saying. So a small percentage, but still not insignificant percentage of homes in the city of Portland have property taxes today that are greater than $10,000 a year. And so that will hurt them on their income tax returns when it comes to deducting that. Capital gains, right, to get the exclusion, both of them have shifted it from, right now you have to live in the home for 2 out of the 5 past years, and then you can sell it and not have to pay the capital gains on it, right? They're shifting that to 5 out of the last 8, so they're making it harder to get that exclusion. Moving expenses deducted, like the moving expense deduction, that's gone. And so you combine these 4 things. In the big picture, is this really significant for housing tax, or excuse me, for tax reform at the federal level? It's not. And how much will this impact any given household? It's a complicated story. If some people it'll hurt, some people it might help because of what they're doing with the standard deduction. I'll show an example in just a second. But what all 4 of these things have in common is they're all a deterrent on home buying or home selling. They all act on the margin to be a deterrent to selling a new home, selling your home and moving into a new one, particularly if you're in the higher income threshold. If you're talking $1 million properties or even $700,000 properties, $800,000 properties, which is what new homes go for in the city of Portland today. We're talking $500,000, $600,000 a lot for new homes closer to the urban fringe, right? You start to get into the places where these things hurt you from a tax perspective. And then the estate tax for those interested. One of them, I think, eliminates it entirely. The other one doubles the threshold and then phases it out over time. I can't quite remember. It's hard to keep all these things straight. But again, that will help people that are in that type of situation. I should note, as an Oregon employee, even if they get rid of the estate tax at the federal level, you still have to pay an Oregon estate tax if someone in your family or your clients passes away. It does not wipe out the Oregon estate tax, so please file your taxes accordingly when the time comes, and I'm sorry for your loss. And so what do I mean by that when it comes to whether it'll make you worse off or not? It kind of depends upon where you are and how complicated your tax return is. Here is a very, very, very basic example. It's not that different from what a standard young couple looking to buy their first home with good professional jobs may be, where even if you get rid of the mortgage interest and you take out the SALT and you cap the property tax deductions, the new standard deduction can still make them better off on this one component of tax reform. Again, there's 120 some moving parts to this tax reform. So focusing on any given 1 or 2 aspects of it, while important for an industry such as yourselves, but holistically is the best way to approach this from a taxpayer perspective. And so this is just a very hypothetical thing to show that you're not necessarily worse off from a taxpayer perspective for this particular reason when it comes to the capping the deductions or eliminating them entirely. I have 1 more minute, and I want to spend time talking about technology. This is something that's fun, potentially, or depressing. When it comes to what is the future of the labor market? What is the future of the economy? I don't know if anybody in this room was part of the Oregon Leadership Summit thing on Monday at the convention center that the business community puts on. They have a lot of policymakers come in, a lot of breakout sessions. I'm involved occasionally on these sort of things, but the guest speaker, the feature speaker for lunchtime was a futurist. And he's talking about, the wave of technology that's coming. And there's a report that was issued not too long ago talking about what percentage of occupations in Oregon have the potential to be automated away in the future, right? And they come with these big, scary numbers, 50% of our jobs are potentially automated. Mine included, right? A computer can put lines on a chart just as well as I can put a line on a chart. Although I think I add value above that, but I don't know if the computer feels the same way. And so there's no question that technological change has greatly impacted our economy ever since we invented the wheel or the plow or whatever, right? We've always had these technological changes that have impacted the types of jobs we destroy and the types of jobs we create. And so moving forward, this is always going to be the case. We have fewer office and administrative support assistants today than we used to because of Microsoft Office and the computer and Expedia.com and scheduling and for a million executives, right? At the same time, you don't have to have an individual administrative assistant outside of every single person's office in the office place or the workplace like you used to, right? So this stuff is always going on in the economy. The question is, are we about to see a tidal wave that's just going to wash over us in the next decade, eliminating so many jobs? I think the answer is probably not. That's my perspective, and I call myself a techno-realist. That's my term. Made it up. There's techno-optimist and techno-pessimist. And the optimists say this technology is just going to wash over us, and we're all going to be unemployed because robots are going to do everything in 10 years. I don't necessarily think that's true. Again, I think there'll always be progress. There'll always be things that are changing. And it really bothers me when people throw up charts like this. So this came from I'm not picking on the bald futurist, that's what he calls himself. I'm not picking on him. I've seen lists like this very much. And it's basically trying to show none of these companies existed 20 years ago. Right? Think about how technology has changed in the last 20 years. None of these things existed. So can you imagine what the next 20 years are going to look like? Right? That's basically the gist of it. Then you start, you're like, okay, yeah, technology changes all the time. And we don't know what's going to come in the future because we haven't invented it yet. That's great. Then you start looking at these examples, and every time I see an example like this, it comes down to the same thing. Most of these companies, they don't really do anything, right? None of these things existed 20 years ago, but most of them don't really impact us that much. A lot of these are really just consumer services that make our home lives easier, which is great, right? When it comes to things like Sonos, right? Sonos makes speakers. They make speakers to listen to music. Did those exist prior to that company being formed a few years ago? I think so, right? I'm pretty sure speakers existed. They have Apple up there 3 times with the iPhone, the iPad, and the iPod, right? It's kind of the same type of thing. Do they really count as 3 life-changing inventions? Not necessarily. And so really, you can wipe out at least half of them, and I'm being very generous here, in terms of things that are really propelling the economy moving forward, that are truly foundational changes that drive economic growth, that drive productivity, that make our businesses more productive moving forward. Most of those things just make our home life a little bit easier, but they don't do anything for productivity in the economy and transforming or raising living standards and things like that. Again, they make our lives a little bit easier, which is great. I love it. I have a Nest thermostat. My Nest thermostat's great. It changes the temperature in the morning and in the evening for me. I don't have to bother with moving that dial just a little bit, right? It's so much nicer. But does that mean the economy is much more productive and the increased capacity within the economy is better today because some of us have a different thermostat? The answer is no, right? It's not a transformational change. And so here, some of these things really are transformational. There's a company called Wi-Fi, but I'm just treating that as Wi-Fi in general. It's making our businesses and our cars and making everything more productive because we can connect it to the internet to a larger degree. Apple and Amazon and Google, yeah, they are transformational companies that are making everyone more productive. Tencent, and I forget how you say that, and Alibaba, same thing basically as Amazon and Amazon Web Services, but for China, right? That is something that's transforming the global economy. Oculus, the potential for what virtual reality will be in the future, I can see that there'll be something transformational about it now, or moving forward. Today, you can just kind of watch cool 3D videos, right? Which is great, but that's not really anything yet. The potential there moving forward. So I just wanted to leave it at that, right? That we think technology will be super transformational moving forward, and it might be. There's no question that it has the potential to do that, and with long-haul trucking being turned over to robots in the near future, as people keep saying, that will uphold or uproot the entire trucking industry. There's no question, right? But that, will happen over many years. It won't happen overnight. And so we may need to make sure that people have the right skills and retraining opportunities to get them integrated into the economy moving forward. There's no question we need to do that. So we need to focus on that and having the right skills moving forward. I just think, being a techno-realist is a much better position to be in than being scared of what the robots are going to do over the next few years. And with that, I'm past my time, a couple minutes. I apologize. That's kind of my email address. joshua.lehner@oregon.gov. Follow us online if anything you've seen today you liked. You can follow us online. All this has been posted there. I'm happy to discuss things here later today, or send me an email or give me a call. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Josh. Was that great information, you guys? Yeah, that was really good. So I'm excited to introduce our second guest. By the way, I'm Linda Degnan. I'm a sales executive in our Northeast branch.